right, good morning, everybody. So in the program, it says that I'm going to talk about future food systems. I will focus on one specific aspect of that, which is urban food systems and food environments. Urbanization is happening very rapidly in Asia and the Pacific. It's happening more rapidly here than it is anywhere else in the world. By 2021, half the population of that region, Asia and the Pacific, will be urban. Now you might ask, so what? I mean, what difference, for food supply and demand, what difference does that make? And a couple of years ago, I probably just said, well, it doesn't really make much difference. You just need to move, food a little bit farther, a few extra food miles to get it to the urban area. It's not that big a deal. But as I've been learning things, I'm coming to view urban food systems, food environments as something that's, actually a quite different animal than the systems in rural areas. And so what I want to do is explain some of those differences. I won't offer any solutions, no accelerators, but what I would like to offer is at least a partial list of factors that need to be taken into account if you're designing solutions, designing accelerators that will work and be effective in urban areas. So the first one that I want to talk about is that urban residents are more likely to be young and more likely to be in the formal labor force. This graph here shows the blue bars are urban areas, the red bars are rural areas. And this shows the ratio of people of prime working age to the number of people that are not of prime working age. And you can see that this ratio is higher in every single country in this chart. It's true for every single country in the Asia-Pacific region for which there are data. So urban areas are younger, they're busier. This affects food demand. A second key difference is that urban residents are more likely to be female in East and Southeast Asia and the Pacific, but more likely to be male in South Asia. Now, we hear a lot about male out-migration, but that seems to be, at least within this part of the world, it seems to be mainly a phenomenon confined to South Asia. And this chart here, again, this following the same color scheme as the last one, it shows the ratio of females to the number of males. And you can see that females dominate much more in rural areas in South Asia on the far right of the diagram. But in East and Southeast Asia and the Pacific, we tend to have preferential female out-migration from rural areas. And because men and women will make food choices in different ways, we need to take that into account, especially given that in urban areas, household sizes often tend to be smaller. They're not just extended families. And even in extended families, the decisions may not be made, in a truly communal manner. Maybe one person or another has more influence over that. So this is another factor that we need to take into account. Refrigeration is much more common in urban areas than it is in rurals. This graph shows some data from various countries in the region for that. This is important because a lot of nutritious foods, meat, fish, fruits, and vegetables, are highly perishable. And so this affects people's purchasing decisions, whether they have access to refrigeration or not. There hasn't been a lot of work done on urban food consumption patterns that I'm aware of that try to distinguish between urban and rural after controlling for the higher income that people have in urban areas. But the work that I have seen seems to indicate that urban residents, after controlling for income, just by virtue of living in urban areas, tend to eat more of these perishable types of foods. And refrigeration is one reason for that. Urban areas have a greater diversity of markets, including supermarkets, wet markets. The demand for convenience in urban areas is much higher than it is in rural areas. Purchasing food, especially highly processed food, is more common in urban areas. And I show some data up here from a few Asian countries on that. You can see at the far right that urban residents tend to eat more highly processed foods. There's less land and lower water quality available in urban areas for homestead food production. I've seen projects that try to just transplant rural solutions to urban areas and say, well, you know, homestead gardens are a good idea in rural areas, let's do them in urban areas as well. Now, I'm not saying it's a bad idea in urban areas, but we do need to be cognizant of the fact that there's less land, less water, and that water is of lower quality in urban areas before we kind of make these recommendations. Urban residents are often more exposed to advertising. And it may be also as well, you can imagine that given the higher population densities, possibly greater peer pressure, that urban residents could be more susceptible to that advertising, apart from the fact that there's more of it in urban areas. And these, we know very well from this conference that advertising affects food demand. There's more sedentary behavior in urban areas, which may affect the type of optimal diet that we want to strive towards for various people. And then eating out, an important one, eating out is much more common in urban areas. This graph, I hope you can see the colors well enough. The top green line is for urban areas in Vietnam. The orange line is for rural areas in Vietnam. And you can see that in urban areas, for each expenditure quintile, that's the bottom axis there, expenditure quintile, this shows the percentage of total food expenditures that are spent on food prepared outside the home. And so you see that rises as people get richer within urban and within rural areas. It's greater in urban areas than in rural areas. Now this has at least two important implications. One is it means that in many ways when people are eating, well, one more thing before I get to that. You know, in Thailand now, for the top 20% of urban dwellers, they get fully half, they spend half of their food budget is on food prepared outside the home. So this is not a trivial trend. This is incredibly important. When you're purchasing your food outside the home, you know less about what goes into it than if you prepared it at home. So that's probably different interventions to make people more aware of nutritional implications. And some of the interventions may be targeted, need to be targeted at food suppliers as well as food consumers. Another key issue about this is that a lot of household survey data does not, it measures the quantity of local currency spent on food prepared outside the home, but it does not measure what that money is being spent on. So when you get to a situation like in Thailand, where some people are spending half of their money on food prepared outside the home, that's not even, we don't even know what they're eating from the survey anymore. And we're just missing a huge amount of their consumption. And so there's a lot of important implications for this. Now let me just, so those are some of the important differences in urban-rural food environments. Let me just briefly talk about some of the malnutrition problems in urban areas. It is true that stunting is more prevalent in rural areas than in urban areas across this region. But the important message to take away from this graph is not that we have to focus on rural instead of urban, it's that stunting is very prevalent in urban areas. Just, it's a big number. It's less than in rural areas, but it's still a big number. And so it's a serious problem here. Now, one solution to that will be economic growth. Probably a lot of you aren't too happy to hear that, but economic growth is really important for giving people the access to the money to access more nutritious foods, meat, fish, fruits, and vegetables. GDP per capita explains 50% roughly of cross-country variation in the prevalence of stunting. So now this is maybe a case of, is the regression half empty or is it half full? Well, it's both. Income is a very powerful predictor. We're going to need economic growth to solve undernutrition problems in both urban and rural areas, but it also is not the only part of the solution. There's 50% that's unexplained, and that's where I think it's important to understand the difference in urban and rural food environments to tackle that remaining 50%. One important thing about economic growth, though, is it will need to reach the poor if it's going to be effective. We see here some graph showing the prevalence of stunting in a group of about 10 Asian countries by wealth quintile, by income quintile. And with the, you can see that stunting is more prevalent among the poor than it is among the wealthy. Obesity is increasing over time in the Asia-Pacific region. It's at low levels, but it's increasing. It's also more prevalent in urban areas than it is in rural areas. So there's another difference between them. This one is where the types of interventions the types of accelerators we use are going to be very important, because at least at this stage in Asia's development, economic growth is not going to solve the obesity problem. It will probably make it worse for many people. So we're going to need other types of interventions as well. With that, let me conclude by saying that all of the figures that were shown in that presentation are from a book that we released earlier at this event, this book right here. I understand copies were available of it before. I don't think any are left, but if you would like to get a hard copy of this, just please send me an email or give me your card here. We'll be happy to send you one. It's also available on FAO's website online right now. So you can get it there. The book is not about urban food systems, but it discusses urban food systems in the context of many other things. Environmental degradation, increasingly complex value chains, changing production and farming systems. So I hope you find it useful. Thanks very much.